Hello and welcome. I am Beth Mashesky, Senior Scientific Specialist at the Illinois Sustainable Technology Center, which is part of the Prairie Research Institute at the University of Illinois. As a land-grant institution, the University of Illinois has a responsibility to acknowledge the historical context in which it exists. In order to remind ourselves and our community, we begin this event with the following statement. We are currently on the lands of the Peoria, Kaskaskia, Piankashaw, Wea, Miami, Mascoutin, Odawa, Sauk, Muskogee, Kickapoo, Potawatomi, Ojibwe, and Chickasaw nations. It is necessary for us to acknowledge these Native nations and for us to work with them as we move forward as an institution. Over the next 150 years, we will be a vibrant community inclusive of all our differences with Native peoples at the core of our efforts. This webinar and all of the Illinois Sustainable Technology Center's webinars are certified green events through the University of Illinois Institute for Sustainability, Energy, and Environment. To find out more about certified green events through U of I, please visit sustainability.illinois.edu. To find out more about the Illinois Sustainable Technology Center's webinars or to sign up for the events email list, please visit istc.illinois.edu/events. A few housekeeping items before we get started. You can download the slides in the handout section of the GoToWebinar toolbar. Today's webinar is being recorded. The recording and slides will be available for viewing online in about a week. I'll be sending an email out to everyone who registered for the webinar once those are available. Everyone will remain muted for the entire webinar. You can type in your questions through the GoToWebinar toolbar, and I'll be reading those to the speaker at the end. So with that, I'm very pleased to welcome today's speaker, Ania Bayers. Ania is the Natural Resources Manager in the Coastal Management Program, or CMP, which is part of the Illinois Department of Natural Resources, or IDNR. She has been with IDNR since the start of CMP in 2012. She earned her bachelor's degree in biology from the University of Illinois at Chicago and her master's in conservation from the University of Michigan. Over the years with CMP, Ania has helped develop program direction and has led and supported a number of projects focused on community planning and coordination, tourism, education, coastal resilience, and habitat management. In her current role as Natural Resources Manager, she coordinates with federal agencies and provides overall program administration, especially with program direction, development, and implementation. So Ania, thank you for joining us, and the webinar is yours.
Thank you so much, Beth. I'm glad to be here. As Beth said, my name is Ania Bayers. I am with the IDNR Coastal Management Program. And I will talk today about how our coastal management program works to sustain our many resources. So, of course, the slides don't want to advance. There we go. Sorry about that. So just a quick agenda. I'll do an introduction to CMP, a little bit of introduction to our work, and then I will go over some of the project highlights just to give you an idea of what sort of work it is that we actually do. So, Coastal Management Program is part of Illinois Department of Natural Resources, which is a state agency. Coastal Management Program is headquartered in Chicago. IDNR is headquartered in Springfield. And coastal management programs are actually a network of coastal management programs under NOAA. And there are 34 coastal programs in the US. And we were the last eligible state to join, and we became approved in 2012. So we have a small IDNR staff who works in our Chicago office, as well as additional staff through partnership with ISTC. So overall, we have about 10 people, plus some additional staff here and there who work for us. And our mission is to protect and enhance the environmental, economic, and social value of Illinois' Great Lakes coast, fostering healthy ecosystems and resilient communities. So we have a designated boundary in which we work, and the boundary extends from the border with Wisconsin and goes south to our state boundary with Indiana. And the boundary is based on our Lake Michigan watershed boundary. So it's kind of a little bit wider in the north, then it narrows down as it goes through Chicago, and then it expands again in the Calumet region. And looking at that map that we have here, I wanted to point out two areas that I'll be mentioning in the presentation. So just wanted to make sure that you have kind of a reference geographically. So here's Waukegan and Waukegan Harbor, which I'll be mentioning. And also within our coastal boundary is Illinois Beach State Park, which is up here. And that's another just area up in the north that I just wanted to point out for future reference. So we are a federally funded program. We receive funding from NOAA, which is the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, and that's under the Coastal Zone Management Act. And also at the same time, we receive funding from US EPA under the Great Lake Water Quality Agreement and the Great Lake Restoration Initiative. So we do have funding sources from these two agencies, and they do fund similar type of work, but there are also some distinctions. So we're able to use those two funding sources to fund all the work that we do as a coastal program. So we are 100% federally funded, even though we are part of a state agency. So what are our priorities as a coastal program? We work with coastal communities, and this includes work with municipal and government leaders to provide technical assistance, coordination, capacity building, and planning. We work on coastal habitats, and that's habitat and species-focused work, such as research, natural resources planning, management, outreach, education, engagement, economic development, and recreation. And that includes activities with communities, nonprofits, and other entities to promote coastal and resource-based economic activity. And also program development, which is more of an internal priority, and that's about improving communication, program planning, building strategic capacity, and funding. And we accomplish our work, obviously, through our staff, but we also give out contracts to other entities, contract grants to other organizations to help us achieve our goals, because there's so much work that can be done. We cannot do it all ourselves. So we rely on those other organizations as well to help us collectively move us forward toward our goals. And we also rely a lot on partnerships. And some of the great partnerships that we have is a partnership with ISGS, and that is where a lot of our staff comes from, through a contractual relationship that we have, and also a relationship with the Illinois State Geological Survey that I'll talk a little bit more about that later on, but that allows us to have a coastal geologist who is and other resources, and that has been invaluable in helping us move our program forward. So that was a little bit about our program and just kind of how we are set up and such. Now, what are some of the issues that we are experiencing here in our coastal region? And these are just some of the issues. So there's a lot more, but the ones that I'll be focusing on today are the changing lake levels, and what comes with that, erosion, loss of habitat, and damage to infrastructure. So those are just some of the things that with the higher water in Lake Michigan, we've been experiencing a lot of these impacts. So that's kind of what I'll be talking about today, and some of the projects on how we address some of these issues. And just some of the pictures to kind of show you just what this looks like in our coastal region. So this is Rosewood Beach in Highland Park, and you can see that that sand has eroded. There's a whole bunch of rocks that are, there's been some damage to some infrastructure down there. Sorry, something wrong with my slides again. There we go. Sorry. This is at Illinois Beach State Park. And that also shows you a beach that has a lot of the sand is gone from the beach due to erosion and just the high water levels that take the sand away. Some of the infrastructure damage on the left at Illinois Beach State Park, you have a parking lot during one of the winter storms or many of the winter storms. Infrastructure gets battered, and that is an unprotected shoreline, so the impacts are felt pretty strongly. So you have parking lot that is in pieces, and then on the right-hand side, that's part of the main office, and there's an observation deck that you can go out on, and that deck is usually covered by rocks, and with the high water levels and the storms and such, all those rocks were washed away, and all that protection that is up there has been removed, and you can see how all those pilings have been exposed. And then moving kind of south along our shoreline in Chicago, that is some of the damage to some of the lakeshore communities, some of the pathways along the shoreline. You can see how all of that is kind of sinking in there. And also at Illinois Beach State Park, kind of focusing on the habitat piece, there's erosion, which means that the habitat is actually getting washed into the lake. And at the same time, another impact is overwash, which is actually the fact that the sand is the high waves are depositing a ton of sand on top of some of the other habitats, such as wetlands. So it's actually covering up some of the habitat. So you kind of have multiple issues, multiple impacts that might be happening because of the high water level. So now that we have heard a little bit about the issues, I'll get into our work on mitigating coastal hazards and working to improve coastal community resilience. And the first project that I wanted to highlight is the Illinois Shoreline Management Working Group. And when you look at our shoreline, there are areas that actually have too much sand, and then there are areas that have not enough sand. And in our region, the way that the littoral system that moves the sand along, the way that it works is it moves the sand from the north to the south. So the sand gets trapped along the way by jetties, harbors, piers, and other structures that kind of protrude into the lake. Also, our shoreline has been heavily armored to protect the infrastructure that does exist on the shoreline. So that means that there's no new supply of sand that kind of comes into the system. So that means that there's just less sand that there used to be in the system, and there's more erosion that's happening. So trying to deal with the issues, communities have been implementing individual solutions to what is a regional problem or a regional complex system. And anytime that you implement a solution at one place, it has a downstream impact at a neighbor property to the south. So it's a complex system. And looking at it, we started a shoreline management working group. And that's a regional working group that meets regularly. And the focus of the group is looking at the system, looking at the solutions on a regional level. The group started in 2015, and Coastal Management Program coordinates and facilitates the group. And there are over 100 participants from more than 50 agencies today. And the mission of the group is to develop a sustainable, cost-effective regional shoreline management system or set of strategies to ensure the resilience of our coast and shoreline. So again, trying to start working together as a region to address these complex issues together instead of on individual basis. So just a little bit of history on how all of this started and why we kind of went in that direction. So back in 2013, Lake Michigan was actually at a historic low. So lake levels in Lake Michigan fluctuate. They go from lows to high, and 2013, 2012 were the low water level periods. And in Waukegan, however, at that point, the water levels were so low that ships were having a really hard time getting into the harbor. And that had economic impact. It's an industrial harbor, and the fact that ships cannot get in means that supplies are not being delivered and such. And at the same time, at Illinois Beach, our state park, we have a recreational beach, and that beach gets sent nourishment from time to time, just because people like to have nice big beaches. So back at that point, the beach just received a whole bunch of quarry sand, and right after we placed the sand at Illinois Beach, we were hit by remnants of Hurricane Sandy, and all of that sand got washed away. And that kind of started the conversation of how is it that, in one place, in Waukegan Harbor, we have so much sand that ships are not able to get in. And at the same time, at other locations, sand is being washed away and there really isn't anything that's left. So that's sort of how we went from individual shoreline. That's how we started thinking about how can we go from individual shoreline management to managing Lake Michigan as a regional resource. And we started this work by giving a grant to Alliance for the Great Lakes in 2015. So we initially engaged them to help us bring the communities together. And we thought that this will be kind of a quick fix. And we're like, oh yeah, we'll just kind of start off by doing this, giving this grant, and this will be a project that will last for like maybe 2 years or so, and we'll figure this out. Of course, it's not that easy, but this was a great start that helped us to get where we are now. So again, in 2015, Alliance for the Great Lakes started us off by bringing together all the different communities along the shoreline. And some of the goals that we had at that point was just to kind of increase the understanding about the shoreline dynamics and our regional lake system. And we wanted to work towards developing a sustainable, cost-effective regional sand management system or set of strategies. And we wanted to ensure the resilience of our coast and shoreline. And some of the outcomes of what we are now calling phase one, we kind of figured out the blueprint for how can we work how can we improve our regional collaboration. We came up with some common goals and values that all the communities kind of coalesced around. And we also came up with an assessment of short-term needs for public shorelines. So that kind of concluded phase one, and then we moved on to phase two. And in phase two, that's when we started working with the Illinois State Geological Survey. One of the things that came out of phase one was that we really need to know more. There just did not have that much data, that much information about what's happening in our system, how is it all working, what are the impacts. So that's when we started our partnership with ISGS and brought on a coastal geologist, and they've been able to provide us and the communities with a ton of useful data. We moved into full group quarterly meetings, so the communities all found this group to be very useful, and they all wanted to meet regularly. And at that point, we had about 35 different agencies participating, and at federal, state, local level. And all of this was focused on public participation. So this was focused on public landowners, communities, not private landowners. And since that time, we have grown to about 150 participants and over 50 agencies. And some of the work that came up in phase 2, so we worked with elected officials on addressing some of the community concerns about Shoreline. We held some public forums. We worked with regulatory agencies on outreach materials and permitting process. That was one of the big things that communities talked about, was like how difficult it was to actually understand the permitting process that goes into shoreline protection. And we worked with municipal landowners on identifying cost-effective regional sand management strategies and kind of identifying those best management practices and shoreline protection strategies for the Great Lakes. And also just kind of initiating and supporting some demonstration projects that I'll talk about a little bit later on. And at the same time, we worked with ISGS to just get a better understanding of our system. So ISGS was doing a lot of topography and bathymetry studies, focusing a lot at Illinois Beach State Park and Openlands Lakeshore Preserve, and kind of assessing the shoreline between Winthrop Harbor and Waukegan, which is in that northern portion of our coastal region. We also funded and deployed 2 buoys that give us additional information on nearshore wave and current measurements. ISGS was studying the impact of winter shore ice impact, developing habitat vulnerability index, and also building a relationship with Wisconsin to share data, research, and strategies. As I mentioned, the sand moves from north to south. So a lot of our sand comes from Wisconsin. So understanding kind of what's happening in Wisconsin and having a relationship there is really important. So that was phase 2. And then we moved into phase 3. And at that point, things started to change, or well, things have been changing as this group has been convening. And in 2019, we're actually at highest Lake Michigan water levels. So the lake levels are rising, and the communities want to know, how can we manage to and respond to shoreline change? How can we protect our shoreline? So at that point, we kind of focus a little bit more on 4 different subgroups. And there was an outreach subgroup that was part of the bigger group, permitting, regional demonstration project groups, and data groups. So there were different leads for different groups, and there were subgroup meetings in addition to our regular full group meetings that were kind of tackling different aspects of this very complicated issue. And some of the outcomes of our phase 3 is just building an information network for sharing all the information that we were gathering. And also just actively disseminating that information to constituents, making that information understandable. So kind of taking some of that scientific information that we were getting from ISGS and developing some of the fact sheets, permitting guidance, a list of shoreline management activities, case studies. And we also initiated some pilot projects. And one of them, we just call it the Rebel Ridge project. The other one is the Section 1122 project, and I'll talk about those later on. But at the same time, ISGS is doing research, data gathering, and we're all working on creating data and data interpretation methods, such as story maps and workshops, just to make sure that all this information gets out there in an easily accessible way. So that was phase 3. Coming out of that, we realized that some of the new directions that we wanted to go in is providing more assistance to Chicago, especially South Shore, improving access to funding and financing coastal resilience, just because there is so much work that needs to be done that our program is not able to fund all of it. And just facilitate development of programs and policies that incentivize coastal resilience strategies. So those are some of the new directions that this group is heading in now. But the one that I wanted to focus as kind of the next example of our work is expanding our work to Chicago's South Shore communities. And up to this point, our work has mostly been focused on the northern section of our coast. And some of it is because Chicago's lakefront, which is about 30 miles long, is predominantly public land that's operated by the Chicago Park District. However, there are some pockets of privately owned shoreline within that land that's managed by the Chicago Park District. And there is a stretch in the South Shore neighborhood, which is about half a mile long or so, that includes many high-rise condo and co-op buildings. And South Shore is a predominantly Black community that has been historically underserved and under-resourced. And with the high water levels in 2019 and 2020, the storms that were happening along the lakeshore had a significant impact on the shoreline. And just again, some images just to kind of demonstrate what that looks like. So here is a picture of downtown Chicago, 2020 storm. And then these pictures are from the South Shore communities. They're taken by community members, and you can see how there are huge waves that are just crashing over a car. And those buildings are right on the shoreline. There really isn't much that's in between the buildings and the parking lot and the lake. And again, just kind of more pictures showing the buildings right on the lake, and some armoring and protection that's not looking that great. So following those 2020 storm events, South Shore community organizers actually reached out to us and IDNR representatives and asked us to come on a tour so that we could get a first-hand understanding of some of those local effects of extreme weather. And understandably, residents were frustrated with the conditions that were happening there, and then also just with the high cost of protecting their property. And they were asking for help with solutions. And we wanted to help, but we also have restrictions. And our funding cannot be used to benefit private individuals or private property. So the fact that these are all private buildings, which are on the shoreline, means that we cannot directly provide any funding to them. However, we found some other ways that we could be useful. So we have been able to connect them to other funding sources and have assisted them in applying to some of the other grants that are out there. We've worked with ISGS to expand their survey efforts to the South Shore community. ISGS has been focusing a lot more on the northern region by Illinois Beach State Park. So they were able to do some bathymetry work at the South Shore region. And then we were also able to provide a capacity support through a partner organization. So even though we cannot fund them, fund South Shore residents directly, we can provide funding to a nonprofit organization to work with the residents to develop a Southside Shoreline Community Resilience Plan. So that work is just in its very, very initial stages. But those are just some of the ways that we have been able to assist with some of the issues which are affecting South Shore residents. And just some pictures of ISGS and one of our staff members doing the bathymetry work with a really cool bathymetry boat at South Shore. So that kind of focus on the South Shore neighborhood, and now taking us back again to the northern region, to Waukegan Harbor, just as another example of another project. And this project, which I mentioned, is coming out of the work of the Shoreline Management Working Group, is the Section 1122 pilot project at Waukegan Harbor. And this project is focused on an innovative application of beneficial use of dredged materials. So what that means is the project involves taking sand from Waukegan Harbor, where you might remember I mentioned that the sand is getting trapped, and at times, like to the point where boats cannot get in, although that's not the case with the high water levels. But it involves taking that sand, which gets trapped in the approach channel, and placing it on beaches of 4 shoreline communities, which are highlighted here on the map on the right. And as I said, this is one of the projects that came out of the collaboration of the Shoreline Management Working Group. And it's an example of a short-term solution that can help communities address an immediate need. So this project received funding under the Water Resources Development Act as one of only 10 projects that was funded out of 95 proposals. And it was the only project in the Great Lakes that was funded. So we're pretty proud of this one getting funded. And all the work is being done and paid for by the Army Corps. And it's a pilot project because we're trying to figure out how the process works. This is not something that has been done in this region before. So we need to figure out the process, what's the permitting behind it, what are the regulatory requirements, how do you go about performing all of it, how do you address community concerns about where the sand is coming from. So there are a lot of different things to address and figure out as we go through this process. So at this point, the dredging on this project is not scheduled to happen until 2023. So we are working through multiple other things before the actual implementation happens. So those projects kind of highlight some of the community work that, or some of the focus on communities that we've been doing. But the next couple projects are focused on shoreline protection at Illinois Beach State Park and on the actual habitat that exists at Illinois Beach. So Illinois Beach State Park is one of the only remaining natural shorelines that we have in Illinois. The park has about 6.5 miles of shoreline. Some of it is protected, but a lot of it is natural. It's very high quality habitat. It has many different threatened and endangered species, and it has a variety of different habitats. And one of the habitats that we are focused on is Panay, or Pan, people pronounce it differently, Panay wetland. And that's a type of wetland that's extremely rare, and it's considered globally threatened. So that's just something that that exists there. And also at the same time, we have recreational amenities at Illinois Beach. We have beaches, we have trails. So there's a lot that that's there that that we want to make sure that we protect. So towards that goal of protecting the shoreline, CMP helped with funding for initial design work for emergent breakwaters that would protect the most critical parts of Illinois Beach State Park, sorry. So those would be breakwaters that are put in at specific locations, and they're oriented at such a way so that they would prevent the waves from reaching the force of the breaks from reaching the shoreline. And that way they would be preventing the erosion from happening. So we provided some of the funding. This project is actually being led by IDNR, which is the owner of the state park. And we provided some of the funding towards the planning that happened behind it. So it was kind of a collaboration, a state federal, federal funds. We provide our federal funds to help with the planning that our state agency was doing to figure out where the breakwaters were going to go, what's the size, what's the orientation and such. And Illinois actually received $45 million in capital funding to continue engineering and construction for these structures. So that's something that IDNR is moving forward on. And at the same time, the project that that came out of the Shoreline Management Working Group and that I wanted to highlight is another pilot project that we call the Rubble Ridge Project, and that's a partnership between a group of landscape architects and many other organizations, as you can see on the bottom with all the different logos. And the idea is to put in shoreline protection that's an alternative to those big, expensive breakwaters. Why at Illinois Beach? And as I said, there's a lot of really important habitat, but also a lot of erosion. I'm not sure how well you can see in the center. We have some pictures that have been done by ISGS that show how much habitat has actually been lost. So there are some aerial images back from 1939, and you can see that dashed line is actually where the shoreline is now. So ISGS has been able to map how much shoreline has been lost, but also just what type of habitat exists in those locations, and kind of project as to what used to be there based on those aerial images. So they've been able to figure out kind of, what is it that we're losing and how much of it that we're losing, and sort of identify those locations which require protection. So the concept is for the pilot project for the Rubble Ridges is to put in a series of ridges that are made out of stone and that kind of create a field that gradually dissipates the energy of the waves as the waves approach the shore. So these ridges are less intrusive, they're submerged, and because they're kind of like spaced apart, they also allow the sand to continue moving through. So they will not stop that littoral drift of like the sand moving from north to south. But they kind of work with the landscape. And in that way, they are more flexible than your kind of usual shoreline protection. And also they're much lower cost. So this is something that that is a pilot project. It is something that has not been done before. And we want to see how well does this perform. Is this something that can be used by other communities, others around the Great Lakes? So ISGS will be doing extensive monitoring on this project, and to see if this is something that to see how well it works, and again, how can be applied and used in other locations. And just a little bit, just more diagrams that kind of show you the shoreline. And again, there are the ridges in the center that dissipate the wave energy. And here's an image that shows both the rubble ridges and then the emergent breakwaters. So the emergent breakwaters would be up towards the north, and then the ridges would be towards the south, and we'll be able to monitor and kind of see how they're performing and how they're protecting the habitat. And the rubble ridges were constructed this summer. So we do have some images from the actual construction, which was really exciting to see that happening. So here you can see there's a barge with a giant crane that was placing the logs. All the construction was done by the Army Corps of Engineers. So again, all of this is a huge partnership with many different agencies involved. And here we have some pictures from like the actual barge on the ground. Is what this looked like. And this was towards the end of the construction. This was a drone image taken by ISGS. And you can see the ridges are underwater, so you can't see them from the shoreline. But with the clear water in Lake Michigan, you can see them from above. And you can kind of see that first ridge that is closest to the shoreline is a lot shorter. And that's because it was actually too shallow for the barge to get in. So that first ridge is going to stay a little bit shorter like that. And then the last ridge at that point was not finished yet. So at this point, that last ridge has been completed. So we're excited to see how this project performs and what we learn as ISGS performs all the monitoring and the data that we get. And again, we're excited just to see how can this be applied in other locations as a lower cost alternative to some of those more expensive breakwater protection projects. And as I mentioned, this was a partnership, so there were many different partners involved. So just want to make sure that I highlight that. And that actually covers all the projects that I wanted to highlight.
So Ania, I think a really great presentation.
Thank you. Yay, and I made it on time. Might have talked a little bit fast at times.
So I'll remind our audience that you can type in your questions through the GoToWebinar toolbar, and I will be reading those questions to Ania. So we'll go ahead and get started with the first one. There's been horrific erosion at Hosa Park, which necessitated removal of much of the boardwalk. Will there be funding to help replace that? Thank you.
So the Rubble Ridge project is actually right by Hosa Park. So we are hoping that the Rubble Ridges will serve to protect the park from further erosion. And in terms of replacing the boardwalk, Hosa Park is a park district, so they can apply for funding to us, but we do not make decisions on their behalf. So Hosa Park is actually part of the Zion Park District. Even though it's right by Illinois Beach, it is separate from IDNR. It's not under our jurisdiction.
The next one is, do you collaborate with Indiana at all?
We do. We collaborate with them a lot more on projects which are kind of focused on the Calumet region. And I didn't talk about those, but we often collaborate with the coastal program, exchange information, and I guess I shouldn't maybe say collaborate per se, because we do a lot of information sharing and such, but we don't necessarily have any active projects right now with Indiana. But there's a lot of information exchange and planning, I would say. And with the Calumet Collaborative, that's an organization that we are a part of, and they work with Indiana as well.
Our next one is, in the aerial photo of the breakwaters you showed near the end of your presentation, what is the dark item that runs perpendicular to and appears to intersect the deep breakwater?
I actually do not know. That is a very good question, and no, I have no idea. I can reach out to our ISGS folks and see if they know. But sorry, I don't know the answer to that one.
Yeah, they would appreciate you letting them know. So I can put you in contact with them after the webinar.
Okay, yeah, that sounds good.
So we don't have any more questions from online audience. So while they're thinking, I'll ask one of my own. Let me pull that up. So, what were some of the biggest challenges that you've encountered over the years with coastal management?
I think some of it is just the number of issues that we could focus on. So I think it's been really interesting being here from the beginning because we started off focusing on, I think we had like 9 different priority areas that we were going to work on. And it took us a while to really figure out what it is that we can really, where we can make a difference. There's a lot of players that, existing organizations that have been working on a lot of these issues for a long time. So we were kind of a newcomer, and we had to really learn what is happening and who's working on what, and are we bringing value added. And also just some of these things are just so much bigger than us. For example, one of the things that we initially had as a priority was brownfield. But brownfield remediation is such a huge, costly endeavor that's just something that our funding cannot tackle. We can help with planning. We can help with some of those community outreach and such. But it took us a while just to kind of figure out our strategic focus, I would say. And I think right now, just also with the erosion that's happening with the high water levels, I think that is just such a challenge to so many communities along the shoreline, and obviously it's a challenge to us because it's a complex, ever-changing system. So we're constantly learning and constantly trying to figure out how do we best address it? How do we best assist these communities in addressing these challenges?
So we've had a couple more come in. So what type of shoreline stabilization measures / structures are allowed in Lake Michigan? And are they regulated by local, state, or federal agencies?
Yes, so all of the shoreline structures would be regulated, and on both on local, state, and maybe federal level, but definitely local and state. So any sort of structure has to apply for a permit, and I am not an expert on those, so we actually do not deal with permitting any of the structures. But to the Shoreline Management Working Group, we worked on the shoreline permitting guide. So I can definitely provide a link to that if that would be something that's helpful. And as for the type of structures, there's again there's a lot. I don't think we really have a list of what's allowed versus what's not allowed. I mean, there's like steel walls, there like rubble protection, natural shoreline, naturalized solutions. So there's a lot, and I am not an expert on any of them, but I can definitely provide some resources if that would be helpful.
Sure. If you send me the links, I can post those along
Okay.
the webinar once those are online. Our next question is, what kind of contact do you have with private landowners along Lake Michigan, and are they open to conducting or allowing management/remediation efforts to be conducted on their property?
So currently we are focused more on the public landowners, and we really have not worked with the private landowners. For the private landowners with the Shoreline Management Working Group, there's the outreach group, and they have worked on kind of some of those disseminating some of that information through the forums and such. So that's kind of how we pass on the information to the private landowners, but we do not work with them directly. But we kind of aim to make the information available if people are looking for it.
Our next question is, if sand moves from north to south, does it build up in the southern end of the lake, or does it continue around Lake Michigan?
So it's actually very interesting because there isn't that much sand that moves. So it kind of gets trapped in Waukegan, and then it moves. Some of it moves past Waukegan, but overall there isn't much sand that makes it like down to Chicago. So like all the beaches that you see in Chicago and such, all of those are constructed beaches. So they don't really receive a ton of sand that comes. But yeah, a lot of the sand kind of gets trapped in Waukegan and sort of south of it, and then it kind of there's like less and less and less of it as it moves south and as it moves past Chicago. So there isn't a huge pile of sand that kind of ends up somewhere at the south end of the lake. And I mean, it used to work differently. That's why we have like Indiana dunes, because the sand used to kind of go that way and build up there. But now, because there's a lot less sand that enters the system, there's also just a lot less sand that makes its way south.
What is the most unique, innovative, or green shoreline restoration/management effort that you are aware of, or which Illinois CMP has been involved in?
So I mean, the rubble ridges are kind of what we consider a natural shoreline protection, or naturalized, I should say, just because of the fact that it is something that's like more attuned to the system, and the idea behind it is to also protect some habitat, to provide some habitat and such. And with we are looking into other natural shoreline protection solutions, but our Lake Michigan is such a high energy system that a lot of those things that work in other environments would not quite work in our environment. So that is something that we are looking into. But some of the cool things which I know are out there, are like underwater reefs, which again provide habitat, but also just kind of work to slow down like the wave energy. And then I guess some of the more standard ones are just like plantings along the bluffs, and just kind of like trying to like stabilize the bluffs with vegetation and such, and or doing a mix of vegetation and more of the armoring, I guess, with some of the rocks and such. So it's I'd say it's a developing field with some interesting solutions, I think, that are coming up. But I think also just figuring out which ones are applicable in our system is very is something that needs to happen.
Thank you so much. That was the last question that we've received. So if you think of something later, Ania's contact information is on the screen right now. So what final thoughts would you like to leave us with?
I don't think I was ready for final thoughts. Didn't expect that question. I think just the fact that our coast is a very dynamic, very, very unique environment, very exciting. And it is something that's so precious on so many levels, in terms of just the habitat, the access, recreation, tourism, quality of life. And it's just something that again is always we're always learning something new. And I think that's part of like the exciting part of this job, is just how things are constantly changing, and we are constantly adapting on how we can protect and manage this great resource that we have right here in Illinois.
Thank you so much for a wonderful presentation, Ania.
Thank you so much for having me.